So, okay, good evening, everybody. Thank you for coming. Welcome to the 49th Annual Midwest Philosophy Colloquium at the University of Minnesota Morris. The Midwest Philosophy Colloquium is one of our campus's oldest speaker series. Over the decades, it has hosted dozens of distinguished philosophers, luminaries of the field such as Saul Kripke, John Searle, and J.L. Mackie. In recent years, our focus has shifted to hosting more early and mid-career scholars whose work we deem to be especially timely and relevant to the broader campus community. In that spirit led us to this year's theme, the philosophy of the Trump administration. As most now can appreciate, the Trump administration marks a profound break from previous administrations, Democrat and Republican alike. Many think departure from the status quo is merely a function of Donald Trump's personality. Others will grant that there are sociological shifts behind the movement. Fewer, however, are aware of the philosophical underpinnings. Indeed, politicians themselves are often unaware of their philosophical commitments. This year's Midwest Philosophy Colloquium is devoted to filling such gaps. Our first speaker is Joseph Porter. Dr. Porter is an associate teaching professor at the University of Colorado Boulder's Benson Center for the Study of Western Civilization. He received his PhD in philosophy from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill in 2022. Before coming to UNC, he studied philosophy and religion at Harvard College and Harvard Divinity School. He has a very high reputation as a rising heterodox philosopher and has exciting forthcoming publications on power, health, democracy, and other topics. I know he has been following the work of Curtis Yarvin closely for some time, and now that Yarvin has finally been identified by the corporate press, such as the New York Times, as an important thought leader, I thought that Porter would be the perfect person for discussing his ideas and influence. So join me in giving Joe a warm UMM welcome.
Well, thank you, Dan, for that introduction. I hope everyone can hear me okay. It's an honor to be a part of the Midwest Philosophy Colloquium and to be part of the same speaker series as people like Saul Kripke and John Searle. Thank you, Dan, for the invitation. Your university is blessed to have Dan. He is a one-of-a-kind mind, very creative thinker, and even when I don't agree with him, I always find what he has to say interesting and thought-provoking. My title is The Dark Enlightenment and the Trump administration. And I'll just jump into things. I think this is an interesting subject. As Dan mentioned in his intro, we've seen some recent articles in the mainstream media talking about something called the Dark Enlightenment and saying that it's connected to Trump in various ways. So I think this is the Financial Times, Time Magazine just a couple weeks ago had an article about the Dark Enlightenment, and then perhaps most importantly, the New York Times put out an interview of a man named Curtis Yarvin earlier this year. And Curtis Yarvin is a computer scientist who back in 2007 started a blog called Unqualified Reservations under the pen name Mencius Moldbug, and now has a Substack called Gray Mirror. And I'll be focusing, there are other quote unquote Dark Enlightenment thinkers, I'll be focusing on Yarvin. And for the most part, this movement it's an intellectual movement that isn't really popular or even known about among professors and academics. It's been taking place on the blogosphere and Twitter or X, and it's mostly been ignored by academics in their scholarship. But I think this is odd, and not just odd, but a problem for a couple of reasons. One is just sheer intellectual curiosity, the desire to understand what is it that people are thinking, whether you think it's intelligent and wise or dangerous and awful. Curiosity. I taught Marx earlier this week. I'm teaching Nietzsche next week. I'm not a Marxist and I'm not a Nietzschean, but I'm interested in understanding what is it that Marx was getting at? What is it that Nietzsche was getting at? So that's one reason. The second reason, I'll quote Sun Tzu, this famous line from The Art of War: if you know the enemy and know yourself, you need not fear the results of 100 battles. And for most academics, most of the people in my profession, the Trump administration and the broader Trump kind of right-wing movement are the enemy. So at least for that reason, maybe especially if you're not a fan of the current administration, understanding this intellectual backdrop of what's going on in the United States, and really in many other parts of the world as well, not only the United States, is something that's intellectually valuable. And I see a lot of common sort of reductive misunderstandings, on my view, of who Trump is, what makes him tick, what makes this administration tick. And I imagine you've seen these kinds of things maybe from, your boomer relatives on Facebook or something like that. People say, well, this is, Trump's just a grifter. And I think there might be some grifting going on, but that's not all that's going on. Or Trump, oh, he's a fascist. I think these are distorted pictures. And you can believe that without defending him or his administration. You can think these are misdiagnoses, incorrect assessments of the facts on the ground. So my goal here is to understand and help you understand some of the new intellectual impulses that are animating the American right in general and the Trump administration in particular. This is mainly a descriptive project, not necessarily defending it, not necessarily criticizing it, just taking this first step of let's understand what's going on. It's also not a complete overview because there's too much to cover in just one talk. And I'm not the biggest expert in the world on Curtis Yarvin, so I'm thinking of this as a gentle introduction to the Dark Enlightenment and the Trump administration. What's this phrase? Why Dark Enlightenment? What's going on with that? And I think broadly speaking and somewhat loosely speaking, this is an intellectual movement that rejects, to a large degree, the Enlightenment. A little bit more narrowly, I think it rejects, to a large degree, or at least doesn't take for granted, the liberal tradition, going back to John Locke and Rousseau and Kant and other Enlightenment thinkers of that kind you may have studied in some of your classes. And this is something different. You think about conservative icons or libertarian icons like Ronald Reagan or Milton Friedman. You think about the founding fathers. For the most part, you can place these people, these thinkers, within this broad liberal tradition. They believe in liberal ideas like limited government, like individual natural rights. The Dark Enlightenment is something at least a little bit different. The intellectual influences are not these sort of conservative or libertarian luminaries like Friedman or Hayek or Strauss or Kirk. Also not fascist thinkers like Gentile. They're thinkers that most people, even most academics, haven't ever heard of or engaged with, like Thomas Carlyle or Burnham or Juvenal or Maistre. And I think a way of getting into what's going on here is to contrast this kind of Dark Enlightenment approach with a more familiar liberal approach. So this is a man named John Rawls, on whom I wrote my dissertation. He's the most important analytic political philosopher of the 20th century. He's a professor at Harvard. And here's what Yarvin has to say, Curtis Yarvin has to say about Rawls. The great engineering problem of designing a system in which fallible humans can govern each other and get along simply does not exist in Rawls's philosophy. In other words, there's this problem that we're trying to solve. How can we get along as human beings without killing each other? And the greatest political philosopher of the 20th century, Yarvin says, he doesn't even address this problem. You might think that's not the most charitable take on Rawls, but let's run with it and think about why would someone say this about Rawls? Well, Rawls' starting point, as some of you may know, is something called the original position. It's this imaginary situation, this thought experiment. There are these people in this situation, to simplify, they don't know their race, they don't know how much money they're going to make, they don't know their sex, they don't know anything about themselves as individuals, and they have to figure out, based on not knowing where I'm going to be in society, what principles of justice would I want for society. That's the starting point on Rawls's framework. It's not digging into the richness of human history. It's not doing a deep dive that's empirically grounded into human nature, how humans behave, what humans are like as social primates. But this is normal for many liberal thinkers. Hobbes, Locke, Rousseau, Kant, a lot of them start with the state of nature. They kind of imagine, what was it like before we had government? And they quote, well, let's look at the Bible and what it has to say here, and that's the starting point. For Yarvin, unlike Rawls and many of these other liberal thinkers, politics is an engineering problem. What do we mean by it? I don't know, this is a liberal arts college. I don't know if there are any engineering majors in the room. I'm not an engineer, I'm a philosopher. I can't do anything practical. But imagine you're trying to build a bridge. The liberal approach, it's like, well, let's just imagine. Let's philosophize. How would you build a bridge? What do I think a good bridge would look like? This is a terrible way to build bridges. Do not try to build a bridge based on imagining in your head what a good bridge would look like. This kind of rationalist, quasi-religious approach, that would not be the way. What does my holy book say? And yet, this is the procedure to a large degree for figuring out how we should be governed for many of these thinkers. But we don't want to do this. If you want to build a bridge, you want to do some material science. You want to think about structural integrity. You probably want to actually go out into the real world and look at some actual bridges, see how they work. You want ultimately to have a sound theory that's been empirically verified that you can then apply in an empirically rigorous manner. Well, what happens if we don't do this in politics? In the 20th century, Yarvin says, almost 100 million people were murdered in various attempts to construct egalitarian utopias. When we replace the political engineering problem with a quasi-religious substitute, we invite disaster. You know this is familiar from history. These are the killing fields of Cambodia, Pol Pot. The philosopher named Dallas Willard says the killing fields of Cambodia come from philosophical discussions in Paris. These people thought they could build a bridge, thought they could build a utopia, and we got killing fields. That's communism. You all know about concentration camps and the evils of fascism, which was a modernist movement, an heir, a descendant of the Enlightenment tradition, not a traditional political movement. But liberalism itself has a little bit, or more than a little bit, of blood on its hands. We know about Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Yarvin points out, You know, the Allies had no qualms about deporting 1 million Russian refugees to the Gulag after the war. Hundreds of thousands of German civilians as slave laborers to the Soviets. So there's a lot of bad government going around in the 20th century, not just related to wars. In the UK, between 1900 and 1989, the crime rate went up by 4,600%. So that means 46 times as much crime. And I got the receipts. This chart, I found the chart. This chart is from the official United Kingdom Parliament website. This chart is not from, patriottruth.front or something like that. And these are recorded offenses in England and Wales. What went wrong? Something went wrong. We stopped figuring out how to build bridges. Yes.
Isn't that just when they start recording crime rates?
Oh, no, I don't think that is the issue. And even, even if we ignore everything before 1920, there's lots of stuff being recorded all throughout, through the 50s. So even if we start at 1950, we don't get a 46x increase, but we get a significant increase.
Can I ask a question about that? But is
Yeah.
there also, what's the percentage of population increase?
This is per capita.
Oh, it's per capita.
Sorry, yeah, this is per capita. I think this is per 100,000.
Okay.
Yeah. So sorry I didn't clarify that. In any case, we're in the middle of some not great governance. And this is the 20th century. We can talk about our own time. It's a hospital during the height of the pandemic. People not allowed to visit their dying relatives. Nurses are posting death announcements in windows. At the same time that mass protests are happening in American cities. You have orchestras with people wearing masks with holes in them. They're blowing out air through their tubas and trombones and trumpets. I mean, this isn't just bad, God, it's silly. And you all lived through it. And I lived through it. We've been living through a literal and figurative bridge collapse on the Dark Enlightenment view. A lot of bad government. And so we should try to fix it, potentially. So what's the connection between the Dark Enlightenment and the Trump administration? I think that the influence can be overstated. There are some factual errors or at least misleading statements in some of those mainstream media articles that I listed earlier. Yarvin isn't hanging out at the White House, palling around with Donald Trump or anything like that. I think the influence is indirect. I think it's partial. I think it's also sort of distorted as a result, but it's part of the zeitgeist. This stuff is percolating through Twitter and other parts of our culture, so it's worth understanding. And what I'm going to do is talk through 3 ideas that I think have had some influence, at least indirectly, on the administration. So we'll talk first about the federal bureaucracy as a de facto oligarchy. And we can contrast the Dark Enlightenment view with the more mainstream view again. What I call the Schoolhouse Rock theory of American government. I don't know. I was in Schoolhouse Rock in the 5th grade, so it has a soft spot in my heart. And the Schoolhouse Rock theory of government is that there are 3 branches of government, right? You've got the president over there, and who's at the top? Supreme Court, well done. And then this is Congress, all 538 of them, and they're kind of huddled up. What's missing from this picture? Well, the American people, over 2 million executive branch employees, not including active duty military personnel and the postal service. So the executive branch, you just see this one one guy over here, the president. But there are millions of people who are employed by the executive branch. They're not represented or really talked about all that much in Schoolhouse Rock. Now, this wouldn't matter. This oversight wouldn't matter all that much if all of those 2 million people just faithfully obeyed every executive order, had no independent agendas of their own, no political leanings of their own. But that's not how DC works. And that's actually not how any large-scale organization works. So if the president of the University of Minnesota system says, we're all going to do this, all the faculty and all the staff don't just say, well, those are the orders, we're going to do it. That's not how it works. It's not how it works in Colorado either, where I am. But this has important implications. You've all heard of the deep state at this point. People talk about the deep state, and Wikipedia says there's a deep state conspiracy theory, but nowadays, this whole deep state thing is more or less acknowledged across the political spectrum. The question isn't whether or not there's something like a deep state. The question is whether that's a good thing or a bad thing. So don't take my word for it. Who's this? Anyone know?
Chuck Schumer.
Chuck Schumer, Democratic senator. Here's what Chuck Schumer says. You take on the intelligence community, they have 6 ways from Sunday at getting back at you. So that's that. I mean, you could almost, is that a threat, Chuck? Like, what's going on there? But Axios says national security leaders and savvy bureaucrats repeatedly thwarted President Trump's demands. This was, I think, during the first Trump administration. Here's a New York Times opinion piece. They're not the resistance, they're not a cabal, they're public servants. And they're opposing Trump. They may not be the resistance, but they are resisting. And again, this isn't Fox News, this isn't Alex Jones. This is New York Times opinion pieces and Democratic senators. Yarvin's claim and conclusion is that bureaucracy is the form of the current Western oligarchy. We might call our system a democracy, but these bureaucrats have an outsized influence over our society. He says, if representative democracy means a system in which power is held by the representatives of the people as chosen in democratic elections, well, yeah, the United States is a representative democracy in just the same sense that the Roman Empire was a republic. I mean, the United Kingdom is a kingdom, right? It's in the name. Chinese Communist Party, it's communist. There's no, people don't buy and sell stuff in China, it's communist. So we can't pay too much attention to names on Yarvin's view. He thinks that when there's a struggle between the civil service and politicians or even corporations, the civil service wins. So on his view, this is kind of interesting. It's the bureaucracy that's in charge. It's actually the president who is the quote unquote resistance. And as you may or may not know, the federal bureaucracy is very opposed to President Trump. So this is how Maryland voted last November. That's DC. So you can see the Maryland counties around DC, very blue. This is Virginia. You can see the Northern Virginia counties around DC, very blue. Here's DC itself. And this is broken up by the individual districts, but it doesn't really matter because they're all very blue. It went over 90% for Harris. And these places, of course, are populated largely by these executive branch employees, federal employees. So its result, here's another Dark Enlightenment commenter anonymously called Handle. It's like, well, if you have 90% of your employees that hate you or don't like what you're doing, they're not going to make it easy for you to get much done. And I don't know what the exact connection is, but I know that there are members of the Trump team who are picking up on this point. So you're Stephen Miller, one of the more infamous, I think, members of the Trump team, making this point that you'd be in a meeting with different executive branch people who are supposed to be working for, in theory, the president, and they'll leak things, they'll lie, they'll distort, they'll talk to the press. Was Trump in charge of the executive branch during his first term? I mean, on paper, obviously, yes, he was a president. I think on Yarvin's view, no, of course not. Was he able to accomplish the things he wanted to accomplish? Did he drain the swamp? If you check the swamp status, undrained. What about now? I think the second administration is importantly and interestingly different than the first one. But I think on the Dark Enlightenment view, what we're going through is a power struggle between Trump and his team, those loyal to him, and an entrenched bureaucratic establishment that for the most part is disloyal to him. And I think this is the main lens through which to understand something like Doge. I don't think that Doge is fundamentally about increasing efficiency. I'm not an expert on the ins and outs of Doge. I take it as an illustration of a broader point, which is that we're seeing a struggle for control of the executive branch. It's kind of an interesting thing to be going through as an American citizen. Why does all this matter? At a very general level, what we might call power mapping matters. Understanding who actually has power, who is actually making the decisions, who calls the shots. And the schoolhouse rock theory of American government doesn't give us an accurate power map. And that's a problem if we want to understand what's actually going on. And this, on the Dark Enlightenment view, is a fundamental problem with most mainstream political thought. It either doesn't even bother having a power map, or it has an inaccurate power map. But if you don't understand how power actually works in your society, you can't solve real-world political engineering problems. It's like not understanding how gravity works and trying to build a bridge. This is true whether you're on the right or the left, or you're a moderate, whether you agree with Yarvin about the federal bureaucracy. This is a more general point that I don't think is even a right-wing point necessarily. And not so. The bureaucracy is just one piece of the puzzle. It's just one part of the power map on the Dark Enlightenment view. And that brings us to our second influential idea, the Cathedral, as it's called. Who rules America? Who actually calls the shots in American society? Here's some possible answers, right? I mean, one obvious answer is, well, the government. Who else, right? The government that has a monopoly on legitimate violence. So Uncle Sam calls the shots. You've heard people say, well, the 1%, right? The billionaires, they're the real shot callers. This is from Barnard College, the Women, Gender, and Sexuality Department website. You've probably heard this kind of analysis too. Well, it's America's a white supremacist heteropatriarchy, that kind of thing. That's where the real power lies in American society. The Dark Enlightenment answer is not identical to any of these answers. The Dark Enlightenment answer is the cathedral has the real power in American society. What is the cathedral? Let's talk about that. To answer that question, we can consider a puzzle that Yarvin raises. The American university does not have a pope. It might as well have a pope. It is at least as ideologically uniform as the College of Cardinals. Yet its local branches are independently owned and operated. What is up with that? I can illustrate this. I don't know if you can read these statements. I won't read through all of them. These are 3 different university statements after the death of George Floyd. Can you tell which university put out which statement? Yeah, Jonas.
I would assume the one that's on top is located closer to like land that was on like directly taken from natives or used in some way, but the rest of them not really.
Yeah. Well, I think most American universities would be on that account, right? Maybe all of them. But
More recently.
yeah. So I think it's basically impossible to say because pretty much every university put out a statement like this. As a matter of fact, this first one is from the University of Minnesota, since here we are. Second one is from the CU system, University of Colorado, my current employer. And then this one's from UNC Chapel Hill. This isn't just about universities, right? Apple pledged $100 million to racial equity and justice. So it's corporations, it's nonprofits. The Mellon Foundation pledged $250 million to rethink the nation's monuments. We're talking billions of dollars in total. That's power. So the cathedral, the mystery of the cathedral, is that all the modern world's prestigious intellectual institutions behave in many ways as if they were a single organizational structure. So there's no university pope of all the American universities saying you have to put out a statement like this. And yet, basically every American university did that. There was no pope of all the Fortune 500 companies saying, okay, it's June, you know what that means, bust out your rainbow flags, and yet pretty much every Fortune 500 company behaves as if it were part of a single organizational structure. So what we're dealing with on Yarvin's view is a broad, high-status coalition that transcends organizational divides. It's professors, it's scientists, it's these old foundations like the Ford Foundation and the Mellon Foundation. It's the media, it's bureaucracy, it's movie stars and celebrities. This is familiar. I think we haven't talked about the judiciary, but that's another interesting, most judges. We have data demonstrating a leftward shift in many professions. You can notice entertainment going very left, school teachers, that's a really interesting one, going very left, tech workers through 2016, the arts. The farmers are holding strong as moderates, I guess, so whether you think that's a good thing or a bad thing. We can look at 2020 donations among the top 100 employers in the United States, among their employees. This is a nice way of getting a sense of where those employees lean. So we've got NYPD and the Marines, and it looks like the US military just slightly leans red. And then pretty much everything else has a leftward lean. And so these are all separate organizations. That's the Department of Defense, that's AT&T, that's the US Navy. But you can see how they might be able to behave as if they were a single organizational structure. And this is really interesting when we think about our political discourse. The whole big government versus big business thing on this view misses the point. Yeah, do you want to?
When was that data, I guess, taken from, like, what year, do you know?
Yeah, this is from 2020.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. So it's a 2020 donation. So if you have this kind of coordination across different organizations and different sectors of society, then complaining about one sector, complaining about the government, or complaining about the big business, you're missing the point. You have an inaccurate power. And what unites the cathedral on the Dark Enlightenment view is not a specific org chart. It's also not some secret conspiracy back room. You know, they all go to Bohemian Grove, and that's how they, whatever, Epstein's Island, you can pick whatever location you think is the most fitting for this. It's the aligned personal and ideological interests of most credentialed elites across the prestigious sectors of our society. I think of this as the avocado toast crowd. These are the people who went to the Ivy League schools, to the prestigious schools. They're parts of these social networks, and they have broadly shared interests. So it's not a conspiracy, it's a social network or a class with aligned interests. And what aligns their interests? In large part, it's the state's soft power. It's the ways that the government has of nudging to very, coercively or not, various organizations and people to do certain things. So Yarvin says the state consists of all those whose interests are aligned with the state. This includes the NGOs, the universities, and the press, and others. The bureaucracy, because right for Yarvin, it's the bureaucracy that's the real shot caller in the state, has vassals. This is a famous political cartoon from back in the day, the Standard Oil monopoly. Yarvin likes to compare the cathedral kind of a thing. He talks about Cthulhu, if any of you are Lovecraft fans. So you can think of the Uncle Sam Cthulhu, the Uncle Cthulhu. And this tentacle could be the universities, this one could be the media. Even private universities get hundreds of millions of dollars in some cases from the government. So are they private? Are they independent? If you're getting that much money? Not necessarily. This is one reason, by the way, that we're seeing Trump start to go after universities. And this is what makes the cathedral so powerful. It coordinates across lots of institutions, across lots of wealth, policy decisions, values, and beliefs. It controls and shapes our information environment. And that matters because controlling of public opinion is ultimately how you control government in democratic or ostensibly democratic societies. And so when we think about something like Trump going after Harvard and Columbia and Princeton, other Ivy League schools, why is he doing that? Is it that he just hates science? I think the way to think about this is, well, these universities you can think of them as basically part of his enemy's information system and their patronage system. And that, I think, is the lens through which to make sense about it. All the Ivy League, these are private universities. They're independently operated, but they're not independently funded. and they're not independently regulated and accredited. So they're a tentacle on the Dark Enlightenment view. And now, at this point, you might be thinking, well, what about Fox News? Like, you're talking about all this, but the conservatives, the Republicans, they have this too. And yeah, I mean, it's awful. I hate politics. It melts people's brains. I wish that 99% of us just had zero political opinions. We just talked about sports and the weather and whatever, gardening, whatever you're in. You're probably not into gardening, but that's fine. But here's the thing: where are wealth, status, and power concentrated in American society? Is it Alabama? Is it West Virginia? Is it the red parts of the state of Minnesota, outside the Twin Cities and a couple other metro areas? Or is it DC, New York City, San Francisco, LA, Chicago, all these famous bastions of conservative thought and Republican strongholds, right? So the better objection, I think, is not the what about Fox News? It's what about Twitter or X? I'm just going to keep calling it Twitter. Yarvin started blogging in 2007, and you might think that this whole Cathedral thing, the information environment, the control over what people are seeing and reading and hearing, is not as strong and not as coordinated now in 2025 as it was in 2007 when he started, or even in 2020. I think that's right. There's an important general lesson here. If you want an accurate power map, power dynamics change, they evolve over time. So an accurate power map will be dynamic and not static. So I think the Steelman Dark Enlightenment view is that America, our society, is going through a power struggle between the cathedral, which has blown through a lot of its legitimacy, thanks to the pandemic, thanks to other things, maybe going too hard on certain social justice causes for the American public's taste. So power struggle between a somewhat less coordinated but still very strong cathedral and a small but growing number of counter elites. People who are elites, who are powerful, who are wealthy, but who are rejecting the whole kind of progressive mainstream narrative. Elon Musk and Donald Trump are probably the two most obvious such counter elites. But on Yarvin's view, Trump is still a massive underdog, which is interesting. Let's talk about our last influential idea, the startup government and the CEO president. What kind of government do we actually have currently? On the Dark Enlightenment views, we've already seen a bureaucratic oligarchy. Well, what's so bad about that, you might think? And Yarvin, he says, look, I mean, it could be a lot worse. You know, the roads mostly work. We have food. Streetlights normally work. Could be a lot worse. Electricity, indoor plumbing, that's nice. Can't imagine going out in an outhouse in Morris, Minnesota in January, February. But it could also be a lot better, right? I mean, the DMV is not famous for its excellent customer service. It's probably better here than in a major city, but the point still stands. And what's the fix? We talked about all the issues of government, crime going on, these wars, famines, just an awful century for government this last century. And Yarvin has a somewhat radical proposal. The president should be fully in charge of the government, like a private sector CEO, or at the very least, the executive branch. Why is this his proposal? Well, the short answer is he thinks this works. Thousands of years of human history have proven at every scale that the pyramid-shaped hierarchy is the best way for people working together to get things done. Pyramid-shaped hierarchy. That's kind of, the newfangled way of talking about monarchy. So Yarvin says all effective large organizations are operated as monarchies. This is true of armies, of restaurants, of movies, corporations. There's not a directorial committee for the best movies that have come out over the past 100 years. Or maybe we can talk about counterexamples afterwards, but corporations, and you think about a military leader like Napoleon, a corporate leader like Steve Jobs, or a director of a Manhattan Project kind of figure like Oppenheimer. Could a committee, I don't know how much experience the students in the room have on working in committees. I find this maybe a more moving question to ask of the professors. Could a committee have accomplished what Napoleon accomplished in battle? Or what Steve Jobs accomplished steering Apple? Or what Oppenheimer accomplished? And Yarvin will say, of course not. And why not? In short, office politics. If you divide control, you're going to have different factions with the incentive. Well, they can always cover their butts. They can blame the other side. They can make the other side look bad. This is what happens in committees. This is what happens in offices. For those of you who are university employees, I assume you've seen this firsthand. I've seen it firsthand. And Yarvin says, look, this is the fundamental problem that we're dealing with in our government. No one has unified control. In every human endeavor outside government itself, undivided administration is well known to produce optimal results. If Pete's could beat Starbucks or In-N-Out, or maybe it was like Culver's, is that a better Minnesota example, right? Mickey D's, by adopting a separation of powers or a constitution or some other kind of government by consensus, they would have done that. But that's not how things work. And we know this to be true in every context except politics itself. So why do we treat politics in the state as an exception? Yarvin will say the fact that we treat it as an exception is why so many things are a mess. The problem is that no one has sole unified responsibility for getting anything done in Western governments. Now, sole responsibility doesn't necessarily mean unlimited power. The argument is not for Palpatine. A CEO can be fired. No one can fire Palpatine. What it does mean is that somebody has the ability to make unilateral management decisions and be held responsible for those decisions. So Yarvin's ultimate political vision is a CEO ruler who's accountable to a board of some kind, just as corporate CEOs are accountable to boards. And the point is to escape ineffective management by committee. But of course, in the context of American politics, this is a radical goal. So what Yarvin calls for, he says, look, you can't do this just by tweeting. I don't know if you know of any presidents who tweet, or by issuing executive orders. You need to replace the executive branch with a new mission-driven executive branch. Hence, startup government. Starting the government up from scratch with a CEO in charge. But I think we can see this idea's indirect influence with the kind of tech, more corporate culture of Doge. You can look at a recent executive order People are talking about something called unitary executive theory. I'm not a constitutional law expert, but people are worried about that. But look, it's calling for presidential supervision and control of the entire executive branch. This is controversial. It wouldn't be controversial in most organizations for a CEO to have this kind of control. We've seen Trump, getting into some Napoleon posting, intentionally or not. But it's worth noting that the Trump hasn't yet come close to following the Yarvin playbook. At least for now, he is nothing remotely close to a startup CEO. He does not have anywhere near the power that a CEO has. Will he get there? I don't know. I don't think anyone knows what the future holds. What I am confident about is that there's no going back, for better or for worse, to the 20th century, to the normalcy of the 80s and 90s that older people sometimes long for. So my advice is to hold on to your butts, because I think it'll be a wild ride. Just a quick recap. Talked about 3 sort of Dark Enlightenment ideas and their potential influence on the Trump administration. This was a very quick, partial, incomplete, hopefully gentle introduction. I haven't tried to give a thorough evaluation to talk about objections, critiques, and so on. I'm hoping that this is the first move in what becomes an ongoing conversation among academics, among the broader culture, among students about these ideas, because I know that many of my students are seeing these kinds of ideas in social media, in the world. And so we should be talking about them in their classrooms as well. Thank you so much. I appreciate your time, and I look forward to people's questions.
Okay, thank you very much for coming. If you'd like to stick around for Q&A, please do. Also, those of you who are online, I see a question already up online. Feel free to post those and I will read them. But we'd like to start with students asking any questions they have first.
Yeah.
I just want some clarification on the power that philosophical ideas hold in regard to political impact. So like, how do you see that the Dark Enlightenment movement influences modern, or is influencing modern politics beyond the Trump administration? I guess, like, in other words, are there other like key philosophical movements or moments from this movement or beliefs rooted in the Dark Enlightenment that have persisted itself through contemporary politics?
It's a great question. So if I, just to summarize, restate it, is it the question whether there are other, like I had that list of 3 ideas, like could I have added to that list? Is that one way of thinking of the question?
Yeah, just like the ways that the Dark Enlightenment may influence politics if it can.
Yeah.
And like other examples of that.
Yeah, I mean, this is a great question. It's hard to think of like just 1 or 2. It's like asking a fish about the water we're swimming in. I think one other idea that comes to mind that I think we're seeing in American politics is a more adversarial approach among this understanding, and this ties in with the cathedral idea that you're not gonna be able to suck up to the left or try to like moderate. And so you just need to be as aggressive as possible and not treat universities and other institutions as neutral institutions, but really go to war. And people will talk about, well, the left, it had its long march through the institutions. It took over all the universities and we need to fight back. So you see, I mean, I talked a little bit about Trump with the universities, but that kind of idea was not on very many, if any, people's radar 20 years ago, and now it is. I think ideas about shifting stance that we're seeing on the on the Republican side on immigration are indirectly influenced by a lot of these ideas, and there are lots of other influences as well. But I mean, I meant Ronald Reagan granted amnesty to people who come to the country illegally. This is a conservative icon, a Republican president, granted amnesty, and gone, for better or for worse, is the Republican Party of Ronald Reagan. I think too, the emphasis on geopolitics. So we're in the middle of all these Trump tariffs, and of course they're kind of, he's like mentioning a tariff and then changing the tariff. So that's all in flux. But the Republican Party, and I should have said more about this. So thanks for this question. The Republican Party, when I was a young warthog, was a fusion of, you had the kind of religious right, and you had, yes, I'm glad some of you picked up on that reference. You had the religious right, you had the neocons, and then like the business, the kind of fiscal conservatives, and this like emphasis on free markets, tariffs. The free market people really tend to hate tariffs, but Trump's going for tariffs, so that's a different way of thinking about economy. It's also just a different way of thinking about the nation and thinking about the possibilities of cooperation among countries. And Yarvin says that there are 3 sovereign nations in the world: Russia, China, and then the international community. But the thought is like, look, we're not going to get China. They're not just this nice other nation that we get along with and we trade with. They're a geopolitical competitor. And that idea, of course, has a lot of currency beyond even just the right. But I think that's another indirect example. I could probably think of others, but happy to talk more. That's a great question.
We have an online person.
Yeah.
Anonymous attendee asks, at one point you said that the cathedral class acts in its class interests. This is true on a Marxian analysis of the ruling class. But why think a group always acts in its own interests? This is a point Manker also makes, for example. It could be that the cathedral class is doing many things that are against the group's interests as a whole, though of course individuals within the cathedral promote their own status interests. To give an example, crime in Europe has dramatically increased as a result of recent immigration policies favored by the cathedral class. But this affects the cathedral class negatively as well. More crime in cities is bad for everyone, exclamation point.
Okay, this is a really interesting question. I mean, I think a lot depends on, I'll say 2 things. I'll try to, the first thing is that a lot depends on how we define people's interests. So we shouldn't define their interests narrowly, not that the questioner was doing this, in terms of just maximizing how much money they make. Because that's not how people work. Some people want to maximize how much money they make. Other people care about money, but care about other things too, like status. So a lot of the cathedral stuff boils down to just a basic peer pressure. I mean, in many parts of this country, if you are an out and out Trump supporter, you're a social outcast. That's a huge cost. In other parts of the country, if you're an out and out, Harris supporter, you might be a social outcast, but those tend to be, that's flyover country for the most part. That's not the big cities where the money and the prestigious institutions are. But I think another more interesting point to make is that why we're seeing some of these, the rise of some of these counter elites, and we're seeing, I think it was the Goldman Sachs CEO during the campaign who was kind of giving some olive branch gestures towards the Trump administration. I think more and more people are realizing that a particular ideology has not been serving their interests in the same way. And I think part of what's interesting about this moment, you mentioned, crime in Europe, is that there isn't any longer a buffer between some of the policies being proposed and the impact on people's lives. I lived in Boston for 8 years, in the Boston area. I mean, Yet New Englanders were all about, many of them, the civil rights movement during the sixties. But there were hardly any African Americans in New England during the 1960s. So what happened, you know, whether or not schools in the South were integrated didn't really change all that much in Boston. And famously, when Boston tried to integrate schools, then a lot of people got you know, riled up about that. So I do think we're at this point where people have, on the margin, lost faith in kind of just the mainstream narrative. It doesn't have this kind of omnipresent presence, that's not the best way of wording the point, that it had even just a few years ago. And I think we can explain that by looking, in part by looking at people's interests. Am I calling on people or are you? Okay, I saw your hand first.
So you were talking about how like in the cathedral, there were like certain subsets and how they were all friends and by like born like by each other. And when you were talking about the structuring of the new government and the executive branch, I don't see how in the Dark Enlightenment idea how we would get back to our same government now, because if the president was a CEO, he would likely need to have more like committees to help him make, because the government has so many tasks. And those committees could make subcommittees, and those could make subcommittees, and we'd just be back to where we are now.
So
So in
yeah,
that situation, how does this address it?
this is a great question. So, and I think this is something I should have clarified more in the talk. There's a difference between delegation and diffusion of kind of ultimate decision-making responsibility. So in a major corporation, you know, Jeff Bezos is not micromanaging each individual Amazon warehouse. He's not setting, you know, this book should cost this much, this, you know, this pair of sneakers should cost this much. He delegates. Every CEO delegates. But the idea is that the CEO ultimately has control to fire people, to say, no, we're going to rearrange things this way, we're going to break up this committee, and so on. And the Yarvin's concern is that the president doesn't actually have that kind of control over the government, over the executive branch. He can't just come in and fire at will. There are other things that he can't do. And so power, the ultimate decision making ends up being divided. And Yarvin, I was telling some people at dinner, it's sort of tongue in cheek, but he endorses Biden back in 2020. And part of the reason is he makes this point, look, it's not even so important who's in charge, is that there be one person in charge. And that person will have to delegate. And will have to be held responsible for making good delegation decisions. But there's a difference between delegation and what we have now with the separation of powers. And no, you can't do this unless this judge says you can, and it's some judge no one's ever heard of, and all the other kinds of constraints that currently exist. On Yarvin's view, which you welcome to disagree with, that kind of diffusion of responsibility means that everyone's just trying to cover his or her butt, and we don't get effective governance. I don't remember. Sorry. Well, that's right.
So yeah, this kind of relates to my question. It seems to me like there's like a glaring hole in Yarvin's philosophy, or I guess I'm wondering if he considers this, like the reason that we have why we diversify power is the same reason we diversify stocks. Like it's less risky. Like if you put all of your money in one stock, it could do really well, or it might crash and burn. And like, you know, how many universities go under? Not that many. How many of them like thrive and like make tons of money? Also not that many. There's kind of, it's a low risk structure. Whereas like a business, how many of them go under? Like what, like on 99 out of 100? They like crash and burn. It's terrible. How many of them are like astronomically successful and are the ones that Yarvin points to as like, this is like the ideal structure. This is how our government should look like. Like one in what, 1,000. And so like, maybe the wisdom behind like our current system is that it's low risk, like, we can't afford to let America crash and burn, like most companies do. And in fact, like, you say like Yarvin, well, Yarvin thinks that we actually, like, Trump hasn't actually began running the government like a CEO quite yet.
Yeah.
But to the extent that he has, many would argue that we're already seeing like a crashing and burning corporation, like on the financials, like the very thing that a corporation should be good at, like making more money. We're already seeing that fail, as we would expect for most like startups, say.
Yeah, so this is really interesting, and thank you for, so. I mean, if it were the case that what we were dealing with was, universities, they're not crashing and burning. And that's the right way to think about this kind of distributed governance, separation of powers. I think Yarvin will say, well, what we talked about at the beginning of the 20th century is 100 million deaths by government. That seems to count like crashing and burning. Now, the United States domestically didn't have the horrors of something like the Holodomor or the Holocaust happen here, but largely at the cost of screwing over a lot of the people in other parts of the world. So on his view, what we've seen, I mean, it does sort of work, but it's also got these major downsides. And I think what someone could say in reply to your point that the majority of businesses fail, you're talking about the majority of businesses that fail are somebody just tried to start a restaurant in downtown St. Paul, and 90% of restaurants fail within the first years. But the majority of Fortune 500 companies aren't crashing and burning. I mean, companies are actually some of the most impressively long-lived institutions in our world. And another interesting example, maybe the most successful institution of all time, the Roman Catholic Church, which sort of looks like it's monarchically governed in a certain way of looking at things. So that would be the relevant comparison. And when a CEO doesn't do a great job, the board recalls that CEO or whatever the case may be. I think that's the vision. But a lot depends on how positive our view of the status quo is. His might be more negative than yours.
All right, I have an online
Yeah.
question. Quote, the notion that a unitary executive could be monitored, governed, removed for a cause in the real world of transactional relations and the exercise of power seems a lot like magical thinking, sort of like imagining how a bridge works. What's to stop this executive then from acting in self-interest just like the employees of the DMV?
Yeah, so this is a great question. And I think you could criticize the whole startup CEO thing is being overly rationalistic in some of the same ways that you could criticize Rawls or Locke or Rousseau or Kant for being overly rationalistic. I think, Yarvin does have some things to say here. We were talking about some of them at dinner. I think the basic idea is you have to think about feasible ways of maintaining board independence and security. He has some interesting things to say, which I'm not an expert on, of all the nitty gritty in terms of having anonymous board members using different kinds of cryptographic security measures to protect board members and ensure the integrity and independence of the board. But you might think, I'm not totally opposed at all to the thought that this might be too rationalistic, maybe too magical thinking, and not as historically grounded, you know, if it's so good, why hasn't some society come up with it? I think that's an interesting question worth wrestling with. Yeah, you in the back.
I'm not sure if this is your assumption or you're talking on behalf of the Dark Enlightenment philosophy, but I feel like the assumption that there really is like a unified ideological left-wing cathedral is not really true, because to me, I see these corporations as being like pandering individuals, and they don't actually hold any of this ideology.
Yeah,
Like, I know you might say like, well, just because they act like that, I don't like their statements do not really translate to anything in reality as far as political activism. And then the other point about this is like, I feel like because you use like 2020 data,
yeah,
it's slightly misleading, because like a lot of these corporations just flip now, and now they're on behalf of the Trump administration, like getting rid of like DEI policy, whatever else.
yeah. Well, I think that these are great points. I think that in terms of the 2020 point, the second point, you know, people talk about peak woke or whatever, and as I said in the presentation, I do think that 2025 is different from 2020. So, and you've all lived through that. You all remember that first year of the pandemic and what that was like. And most of you were here in Minnesota when George Floyd was killed, and you saw the way that not just the country, but the world reacted. And what we're seeing, what we're living through now is not what we were living through in 2020. It's different. I think that's a statement that's not a value judgment. That's just my sense of the way the world has changed. So I think there is some truth to that. And I think, I don't know whether Yarvin has acknowledged that, but I'm happy to acknowledge that. In terms of the first point, I think you're right. And this is something that Yarvin does talk about a little bit. And it's something really fascinating and worth pondering more, because you do have, you know, what you might think of as true believers in really in any political coalition. And then you have panderers or opportunists and people who don't really care as much about the beliefs, and maybe, you know, so if your point is not every Fortune 500 CEO was really is like a bleeding heart, you know, far left progressive, I think, yeah, that's almost certainly true. So I think the point of the cathedral is less that everyone is a true believer, and more that there's some mechanism that's coordinating the actions of institutions of various kinds in an impressive way, in a way that's worth reflecting on. I think something that I didn't talk about at all that is worth reflecting on further is what the relationship looks like between, you know, what you might think of as the kind of mainstream, more establishment, kind of progressive faction, and then like the activist left, and what that relationship looks like. And Yarvin does have things to say about that, which I didn't get into, but it's certainly the case that they're not the same. That doesn't mean that they're not able to find some way of coordinating, even though they're famous for squabbling in various ways and so on. Yeah. Yes.
So, there's, within like the Dark Enlightenment philosophy, there's sort of like the argument from natural selection for the hierarchical structure. So, this was just sort of a thought that I had while you were talking about it, but, you know, if we are to observe like these competitive institutions as sort of the models for how we behave, like, why wouldn't we look at that and say, oh, well, they all subscribe to like this sort of progressive identity politics view. That means that's the most, you know, effective institution as well, or the most effective belief system. You know, it's like, if the corporation does it, justifies the hierarchy.
Yeah.
If the corporation does it, justifies the politics in a similar way.
So I'll say something, and you let me know if this is responsive to your question. I think what Yarvin would say is that over the past century or so in particular, the left has been very good at acquiring power and not so good at wielding it effectively for, the betterment. So, early 20th century, the Russian revolutionaries and other people, like they're trying to figure out like what's the way that we actually take over. And they do in Russia, in China, and other places. What they don't do is bring about the stateless, classless, utopian society. And so, in many ways, we can think of politics as wielding together two kinds of problems. One is how do you gain and maintain power, and the other is how do you actually exercise power effectively for not just for your own self-interest, but for society. And ideally, we could come up with a political system, a solution to these two different engineering problems of, a system that's able to gain and maintain power, and then also use it in a way so that crime isn't going up by orders of magnitude and, hundreds of millions of people are dying. And so I think Yarvin's critique of the left would be, yeah, it's really good at the gaining power, and it hasn't been as good at the wielding. And in the left, not just the American left, but like including 20th century communists and so on. Yes.
So why do you bring up like CEO, or why are we talking about CEO? Like, do you think that the US is headed towards like a CEO direction, or do you think that it currently is? Because like I could see how it currently is.
Oh, yeah, no, so, I mean, I bring it up because it came to mind as one kind of interesting and important influence on the current administration. And, these debates about the unitary executive theory that I mentioned are ongoing and important. Yarvin's view is that we don't have a CEO. That would be my view as well. So I bring it up because it's something that he's talking about that is kind of, I think, percolating through the current political discourse. I think most people wouldn't say we have a CEO. I think the question is whether we should. And Yarvin's going to say, yes, we should. That would be a better model. I think the vast majority of American, political commentators would say, no, we shouldn't. It's in some ways deeply antithetical to the American way of thinking about government. And I don't think, I would say, Yarvin's view is that Trump is a massive underdog. I think the idea of setting up the American government in the way that Yarvin proposes, that's a long shot. I mean, you're talking about restructuring one of the largest and most powerful organizations that the world has ever seen, with deep opposition within that organization to the restructuring you have in mind. That's at the very least an uphill battle. Whether or not it's a good thing, I wouldn't bet on that kind of thing happening.
Corporations are for profit, and we should be for the people. I don't know.
Well, part of the interesting thing about the CEO and board model is that nonprofits have CEOs with boards. So my mother works for a nonprofit organization. It has a CEO and it has a board to whom that CEO is accountable. So Yarvin's point isn't so much look at the for-profit organizations. I think he's not allergic to for-profit corporations, but the point is this way of structuring an organization. An army is not a for-profit corporation, but he'll point to armies as organized in this pyramid way, and that's what you need for an effective army. He'll say that's what you need for an effective large-scale nonprofit. It's not so much about seeking profit as the goal, it's that whatever your goal is, committees are going to generate office politics, which is just going to gunk up your organization and prevent it from being as effective as it could be. That's, whether or not you agree, I think that's the basic rationale, or at least one of them for the view. Yes,
Just a question for me.
yeah,
This sounds, like, as some others have mentioned, it's not very empirical in the sense that, there's not historical precedent. As, I mean, like, even his appeals to pyramidical structures historically, or maybe I'm misunderstanding his view, but the idea of a CEO president or a CEO king, it sounds very pragmatic to me. You know, like, what do CEOs wear? Like business suits, or, you know, like if they're West Coast, they wear, you know,
Sure.
sneakers and a
Yeah.
sweater. And where people want to see, if they're going to go monarchist, they want to see their king in robes
Yeah.
and ermine, and, you know,
Yeah.
they want trumpets playing, and they want to see themselves, you know, and all this pageantry, maybe tied up in a religion or something like that. And does he endorse anything like that, or is he way more just like pragmatic? And if it's more
Yeah.
pragmatic, well, maybe that's actually not what the human frame wants. Maybe if we're gonna go monarchist, we need to have something way more meaningful.
no, and I think that he's aware of and sensitive to this kind of concern. I mean, this touches on a broader divide, I think, within the new right. So you might know somebody who's, you might yourself be one of these people. It's like hyper traditionalist Catholics who are all about Latin mass and that kind of thing, or Eastern, you know, orthobro, whatever. And so there's this very traditionalist strain. And then you have Elon Musk as an example of the tech right, and that's not very traditionalist. It's
Having babies with random women all over.
yeah, not I mean, you can't look at that as, it's traditional, but
Oh,
not
yeah, yeah.
traditionalist, right? And this is a divide. There are these people who are looking at, you know, the future, and there's kind of this cyberpunk dimension to this politics, and then there's the, you know, like, you know, take back Constantinople Crusaders side, which is very, very different aesthetically, but also practically. And Yarvin, at one point, he says something like, it's hard for me to see a king coming back except under the banner of the cross. So that, I think that quote alone kind of shows that he is sensitive to these kinds of concerns. Now, the interesting question, and I'm not sure he's ever addressed this directly, is whether you can wed the traditional pageantry with this board and CEO structure. I think in principle you could. I'm not sure you could in America. I mean, America is this really interesting case. But could you probably wouldn't call him a CEO, but could you have a king in some European state with a history of monarchy? And could you have, you could call them regents, maybe, the board of regents, you know, something along those lines. Like, that doesn't strike me as, you know, metaphysically impossible or anything like that, but it's an important question. Yeah.
I was wondering if the Dark Enlightenment like addresses how just fundamental it would change like American government. Because in my mind, when you're talking about like the CEO position and the board of directors, like you can have direct power or like, hold them accountable. That would mean that they couldn't have influence on who's on that board of directors. And if the board of directors, depending on who you consider it, like currently how the system works, the president would have like influence on what would be on the board.
So if the question, yeah, I mean, the even just the stuff I sketched here, the proposal it's radical. This is not this intellectual movement is not reformist in the sense of, hey, let's tweak, you know, we can tweak our tax policy and that'll solve all our problems. The thought is, no, the rot is deep and we need a fundamental change. in how we're governed, what kinds of policies we have, our institutions. This touches, by the way, on the part of your question, Will, about the financial markets going down. I think the thought would be, if you're in a really bad position, there's no pain-free way of riding the course. Obviously, you can disagree with that, but that's the rationale. And this is a problem for any political movement calling for, radical fundamental change. This is a question, well, how do we get there? And how do you know that it's worth it to get there if you're gonna need a bloody revolution or whatever the case may be? And the Dark Enlightenment isn't calling for bloody revolutions, but many communists were and are. But so I think this is a big question. How do you get there? And I'm not sure. I mean, Yarvin has different ideas of how to get there, but the main thing he registers is a pessimism. But I think the thought is that Trump or whoever's president, Biden or Gavin Newsom come 2028 or JD Vance, it doesn't really matter, Republican or Democrat, somebody would need to seize power in a way that no American president has since FDR. So in Yarvin's view, FDR kind of came close to being a CEO president. And on Yarvin's reading of FDR basically said to Congress, look, if you don't do the things that I need you to do, I'm gonna have to do them. and he took control of the government. But there's no simple or gradual, like this is not just nudging, tweaking, this is a call for a much more substantive fundamental change to our governance structure.
One last question maybe, and then.
Yeah, I think I saw you raising your
Yeah, I
hand.
had a question that kind of backpacks off of my original one. How do you think philosophical ideas like those from the Dark Enlightenment translate into political actions? And more so, like, is it possible that ideas of the Dark Enlightenment, or even just philosophical ideas in general, can truly encourage or even guide the implementation of policy, or are they like more so used as tools to legitimize or amplify political ideologies?
Okay, yeah, this is a really interesting question. I think that they can influence action and policy. John Maynard Keynes, who is probably the most influential maybe economist ever, he has a quote, I'll paraphrase. He says something like, we're all like slaves to dead philosophers we haven't heard of. And the thought is, the way you look at the world, the things you value, the theories you have about how things work and the decisions you make, the policies you espouse, you didn't come up with all of them. If you support universal health care or if you support free markets, you didn't come up with the idea of the free market, or like somebody else came up with those ideas. And so there is this kind of indirect influence that I think is undeniable from any intellectual movement. I see these kinds of ideas on Twitter and this kind of culture on Twitter, and then I see, Donald Trump and JD Vance on Twitter, and Elon Musk, of course, on Twitter. And so the at least one mechanism for how ideas are spreading is clear. But I don't think that the influence is normally direct. As I said at the beginning, I don't think their top administration officials are like, what would the Dark Enlightenment? I think it's more about a shift in the overall cultural zeitgeist that we're seeing, that I think is in part due to some of these ideas.
I'm just gonna ask one last question
Yeah.
from the chat. Okay, this will be our last question. It's from the chat. 2 questions. Can go over both or either. 1, has the world actually gone downhill as much as the graph on increased crime would really suggest? I'm thinking about how Steven Pinker would argue how we're actually doing better recently with less violence, fewer wars, and less extreme poverty. 2nd, would Yarvin think the best way to pick a CEO for the country would would be from voting from the public, because if the Fortune 500 companies had their CEOs selected by who the public voted for,
Yeah,
that probably wouldn't work well.
yeah,
I would also think it wouldn't work well if CEOs were more or less guaranteed to stay in their position for 4 years regardless of performance. These just seem like important points stopping a CEO model from working well politically.
well, so I'll try to answer both quickly. So the second point, I don't think that he would say that the best selection mechanism is a universal vote. The more fun thing he would say though is, well, if we elect a monarch on the basis of a democratic vote, isn't that democracy? Isn't that what you all wanted? And so we can talk about whether that's like the pure democracy or the pure antithesis of democracy. And yeah, term limits are not the kind of thing that would be, I think, built into his model necessarily. In terms of the first point, I think what he would say, I mean, things have gotten better in many ways. They've also gotten worse in other ways. So I'm not an expert on all, history of war. I do know that, I wrote about this in my dissertation, during the 20th century, at the beginning of the century, 9% of deaths were civilians. And then it went up, I think, all the way to 90% were civilians. So we've seen change, we've seen improvements, but I think there are some clear trends that are negative. And teasing apart all the causal relationships is a messy business. The world is complicated. But I think at a basic level, Yarvin's view would be, technology has gotten a lot better, and that's made people's lives better in lots of ways. And government has not necessarily kept up with the progress that technology has made. And so let's apply more of an engineering mindset to government so that we can have better government to go along with some of the other improvements we've seen.
All right, well, join me in thanking our speaker. And thank you to our, those who came online. Thank you very much. See you tomorrow, maybe. We have another talk at 5 tomorrow.